Brenner Niles stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately regretted not reading the fine print of the assignment. The sky over Relhax 4 glowed a dull orange, gritty particles swirling in slow, unpredictable spirals. At first glance, it looked like a warm sunset at a beach. Then one of the spirals slammed into a nearby warning beacon and snapped it clean off its pole. "Welcome to the Dunnafront," a voice said. Brenner turned. The speaker was tall, wiry, and lime green, with two long eye stalks that twitched independently. It wore a sash embroidered with a dozen symbols that Brenner guessed were either academic honors or warnings. "I am Instructor Pradix," the alien said. "You must be the human participant." "Only one," Brenner asked, adjusting the strap of his equipment bag. "Only one who agreed," Pradix replied. "The others declined after reading the risk clause." Brenner exhaled. "Well, I needed the credit." Pradix blinked both eye stalks in unison, a gesture Brenner later learned meant approval. "You will do." They walked across the compound, a cluster of domes half buried in sand. Other students milled around. Most were Kintari, like Pradix, but Brenner also spotted a few squat, scale-covered Groxians and one nearly translucent Weren. All watched him with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Why is this course even a thing?" Brenner asked. Pradix led him through a narrow tunnel into a large briefing chamber. "It is a tradition," he said. "Our ancestors tested endurance against the planet's harshest storms. We honor that by exposing our brightest minds to controlled sandstorm environments." "That doesn't sound very controlled." "The storm begins tomorrow. At dawn, you may construct any structure you wish to endure its duration. No assistance, no automation. No shielding from the compound." Brenner stopped walking. Wait, I have to stay out there, during the storm, for 20 hours, Pradix said, "unless you forfeit, but that will cost you the full credit." Brenner rubbed his face. "And how bad is this storm?" Pradix's eye stalks tilted to a monitor. It showed a swirling mass of atmospheric rage heading toward their location. Sustained winds of 200 kilometers per hour. Sand density high enough to strip paint. Temperature swings from sub-zero to boiling. Brenner stared at the screen. "You call this a class?" "It is our most respected practical," Pradix said. "Now you have 12 hours to prepare." The compound provided a small supply depot. Each student received identical materials: 6 reinforced polymer sheets, a bundle of flex steel rods, a thermal tarp, adhesive patches, and a roll of sealant tape. Brenner examined his pile while nearby students began assembling sleek, aerodynamic pods with practiced ease. He didn't have a design. He didn't even have a clue. By nightfall, most students had already retreated into their storm shelters to run diagnostics. Brenner sat alone under the hazy stars, surrounded by tools and failure. He sketched in the sand with a stick, muttering to himself. "Okay, wind resistant. Needs anchor points, needs to vent heat but not let sand in, needs to not fly away." He disassembled and reassembled the rods twice before an idea formed. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't even symmetrical, but it was heavy, low to the ground, and flexible enough to bend without breaking. Using his emergency rations as ballast, Brenner built a dome-like shelter sloped backward, with the thermal tarp stretched taut over layered polymer sheets. He punched holes in the rods to thread the sealant tape through, anchoring the structure deep into the sand. Every joint got double-wrapped. The entrance faced away from the storm's path and had a makeshift airlock flap. He finished just before dawn, his hands blistered and raw. Pradix came by, eye stalks tilting at odd angles. "This is unconventional." "It's what I could manage," Brenner said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I am curious to see how it performs." The storm struck like a hammer. Brenner barely made it inside his shelter before the first wave hit. The walls groaned. Sand hissed through every microscopic gap. The temperature rose fast, then plummeted. He tucked himself in the center, breathing shallowly through a filter mask, clutching the frame every time the wind threatened to rip it loose. After 6 hours, one of the rods buckled. He used his own belt to brace it. At the 10-hour mark, the thermal tarp began to peel. Brenner crawled to the edge and slapped it down with sealant patches, his fingers numb and bleeding. By hour 15, the adhesive began to fail. He stripped the lining from his jacket to reinforce the seams. Outside, the storm howled like a living thing. Inside, Brenner pressed his back to the shaking frame, teeth chattering from cold and stress. At hour 20, silence fell. A weak shaft of dusty light pierced a crack in the tarp. Brenner crawled out, coughing. The compound had vanished under a sheet of sand. He stumbled toward where he thought the dome had been, every step a fight. His knees buckled halfway there. Someone lifted him. It was Pradix. "You endured." Brenner blinked up at him. "Did I pass?" Pradix tilted his eye stalks. "Your structure held longer than the Warren's. And none of your limbs are missing." "Yes, you passed." Brenner coughed again. "Can I sit down now?" "You may sit for as long as you wish." He sat, then lay flat. The sand was still warm from the storm, and for a moment he let his body sink into it. Later in the infirmary, Brenner sat with his arm in a sling and his side wrapped. "You sprained your shoulder and have 3 cracked ribs," the medic, a Groxian named Vexel, said. "You humans are surprisingly intact." "I'll take that as a compliment." "You should not." "You are lucky," Brenner groaned. "Story of my life." Pradix visited later, carrying a data tablet. "Your shelter design has been added to the course archive," he said. Brenner raised an eyebrow. "Seriously, your improvisation under pressure was instructive. Some of our students have grown too reliant on theory. You reminded them that survival is not always elegant." Brenner grunted. "Glad I could be educational." Pradix extended a thin hand. "Will you return next cycle?" Brenner stared at the hand. "Do I look like I've lost my mind?" Pradix's eye stalks twitched. "I shall take that as a maybe." Brenner's ribs ached with every breath, but he was determined to walk unassisted. The Groxian medic, Vexel, trailed behind at a cautious distance, arms folded, tail flicking like a metronome of disapproval. "You're going to tear the cartilage again," Vexel said. "If I lie on that cot any longer, I'm going to start hallucinating conversations with the ceiling tiles," Brenner said, trudging forward with the stiff gait of someone trying not to sneeze. They moved through a side corridor of the Relhax 4 outpost, where the walls were etched with intricate reliefs of what looked like ceremonial sandstorms, each more dramatic than the last. Groxian students were repainting a section with white pigment that smelled like burnt almonds, and one of them paused mid-stroke to stare as Brenner limped by. "Is that the human?" one asked in a low rasp. "No," Brenner called over his shoulder. "I'm a hallucination." "Please resume ignoring me," Vexel sighed. "You're becoming a campus legend. You're still technically enrolled, you know." "Wait, really? They haven't processed your paperwork yet." "Pradix says you're under active academic observation, whatever that means." Brenner stopped at the junction to the central dome. "I think it means they're trying to decide if I'm a resource or a liability." "They're Kintari," Vexel replied. "They'll take 2 seasons to decide what to have for breakfast." A soft chime echoed from the intercom above. "All students report to the Orly's courtyard, debrief session commencing." Brenner turned slowly, wincing. "That would be my cue." "I'll fetch a stretcher," Vexel muttered. "Nope." Pride still intact. Barely. The courtyard was a shallow bowl carved into the rock, lined with semi-transparent panels that filtered the harsh daylight into rippling hues of violet and turquoise. It was full now, rows of students in various postures of exhaustion and bandaging. The Warren who'd lost part of their shelter sat in a nutrient mist chamber, still pink and slightly translucent. A Groxian with a cracked cranial plate leaned against a rail, chewing dried root bark. Brenner found a spot near the back. No one sat beside him. Pradix stood at the central dais, wearing a new sash, this one stitched with gold thread and what looked like an embroidered gust of wind devouring a hut. "Congratulations," Pradix began, "to all who survived the Dunnafront trial. You have faced Relhax's wrath and endured." "Most of you?" A few heads turned toward an empty seat where a Kintari student's nameplate sat untouched. Let us reflect, Pradix continued, not only on the failures of design but on the resilience of spirit. One of you in particular has demonstrated alarming levels of both. Brenner shifted as all heads turned toward him. He tried to wave but only managed an awkward half-raise of his splinted arm. Pradix beckoned him forward. Brenner stood slowly, dragging his left foot slightly. He made it to the dais and stood squinting into the filtered light. "Human," Pradix said, "you endured without formal preparation, without habitat simulation, without even a planetary climate adjustment period." "I also endured without sleep, water, or a working femur, apparently," Brenner muttered. "There is curiosity about your methods," Pradix said. "We ask that you demonstrate them. Right now, instruction is best when the memory of pain is vivid." Brenner turned toward the crowd. "All right. I used the polymer panels to form a sloped wedge against the wind's direction. I buried the base deeper than I thought necessary, then buried it more. The flex rods were too light, so I tied my food packs to the ends to keep it from lifting. I reinforced joints with thermal tape, jacket lining, and eventually my belt. I prioritized survivability over comfort." A tentacled hand shot up from the front row. "You," Brenner said. A student with a translucent dome-shaped head asked, "Why didn't you use the adhesive patches as external reinforcement?" "Because they melted," Brenner said. "The storm got hot enough to liquefy the patch resin. I stuck them inside where the heat was lower." Another student, this one with 3 mandibles, leaned forward. "You used your clothing?" "Yup, not ideal, but better to be cold and alive than fashionable and dead." A low whistle passed through the crowd. Pradix nodded. Improvisation under stress. A trait once dismissed as recklessness, now perhaps a subject of study. Brenner sat back down, sweat collecting under the edge of his bandage. After the debrief, Pradix approached with a scroll-like device. "You're being offered a position," he said. "I'm already enrolled." "Not as student, as adjunct," Brenner blinked. "Wait, you want me to teach, not theory, application, field simulation, scenario response." "I just got out of the field." "I still have sand in my teeth. You'll be compensated." Brenner looked past him at the students gathering in clumps, whispering animatedly. One was sketching a diagram on a tablet, clearly replicating a version of his shelter. He exhaled. "On one condition." Pradix tilted his head. "No more sandstorms." Pradix clicked a small device. A hologram of a frozen wasteland blinked into view. "The next module is cryo-endurance, sub-zero exposure." Brenner stared. "Of course it is." 2 days later, he stood in a different dome, this one refrigerated to mimic the glacial regions of Relhax's southern pole. He wore a thermal suit that didn't quite fit, and his breath came out in visible puffs. A group of students gathered around a pile of standard issue materials, thermal blankets, solar panels, and frost-resistant sealant. "All right, listen," Brenner said, gesturing with his good arm. "First rule of cold survival, conserve heat, don't generate it. Body heat is your currency. Spend it wisely." A student raised a hand. "What if we use the solar panel to power a heater? You'd get maybe 30 minutes of warmth before the battery dies. Then you'd be colder than before because your body didn't acclimate. You want insulation, not artificial heat." They looked skeptical. Brenner grabbed a thermal blanket and wrapped it around himself like a cocoon. Layers, air pockets, shelter that breathes just enough to stop moisture from freezing inside but not enough to lose heat. Think of it like trapping your own stink and being grateful for it. The same translucent-headed student from before nodded. "Efficient, disgusting, logical." "Exactly. Efficiency is rarely glamorous." Another student, a tall insectoid being with eye clusters, crouched by the material pile. "And if our suit fails?" "Then you get creative. Use the solar panel as a windbreak. Stuff insulation into every gap, even your boots." A Warren student tilted their head. "What if we panic?" "Then you breathe, slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth. You can't outsmart the cold. You can only outlast it." By nightfall, the students had built their shelters. Brenner inspected each one, adjusting seams, pointing out weak spots. He didn't touch anything, just guided. His voice was hoarse by the end. Back in the observation dome, Pradix waited with a steaming mug of something that smelled like cinnamon and metal shavings. "You're effective," he said. "I'm tired." That is the nature of instruction. Brenner leaned against the wall, eyes half closed. Do you ever wonder why humans are like this? Yes, frequently. We're not built tougher. We're just too stubborn to quit. Pradix handed him the mug. That, too, is a curriculum worth studying. Brenner took a sip. It was bitter, oddly salty, and immediately cleared his sinuses. Next module after cryo-endurance, Pradix said, is hypoxia navigation. High-altitude, low-oxygen environments. You may begin preparing the lesson plan. Brenner groaned. You're trying to kill me, not kill. Observe. I'll need a helmet this time. Already requisitioned. Brenner nodded slowly. All right, but if anyone tries to make me run uphill, I'm staging a revolt. Pradix lifted his eye stalks. Noted. Outside, the wind had returned, not the storm kind, just a whisper brushing across the domes. But Brenner didn't flinch this time. He was already thinking about air pressure, lung capacity, and how to simulate mountain terrain in a desert climate. And despite everything, some part of him buried beneath the bruises was curious. Maybe there was a science to stubbornness after all. The hypoxia simulation chamber looked more like a luxury greenhouse than a death trap. Light filtered in through high glass panels, casting pale reflections on the frost-lined interior. The floor was uneven, sloped like a rocky incline, and the ceiling gradually arched higher toward the simulated peak. Machines tucked into the walls monitored oxygen levels, gradually thinning the air to mimic the pressure at 25,000 feet. Why not just take them to a real mountain? Brenner asked, strapping a pressure sensor to his wrist. Pradix adjusted his eye stalks, both focused on a digital readout. Because exposure to actual altitude without acclimation results in fatalities. You are here to minimize those. I'm flattered to be the difference between life and death. You are also the only instructor with a circulatory system inefficient enough to match the simulation parameters. That's the worst compliment I've ever received. You're welcome. The students arrived in staggered groups, each wearing compression suits and light packs. A few looked eager. Most squinted at the incline like it had personally insulted them. Brenner stood at the base, breathing evenly. First off, he said, pacing slowly so his voice carried, you're going to feel fine. That's the trap. At simulated 6,000 feet, your blood starts to carry less oxygen. At 10,000, your brain starts lying to you. At 15, you'll think you're doing great while walking like you've forgotten how knees work. A long-limbed student clicked their mandibles. And if we simply breathe faster? Then you'll hyperventilate, pass out, and roll down the rock slope like a meatball with aspirations. They stared. Look, he said, the goal today isn't to reach the top, it's to understand what your body does when it's under pressure. Literally. You're going to walk, climb, and observe. You'll document your heart rate, coordination, and mental clarity. You'll also listen to your body. If you stop listening, you stop learning. The students filed onto the slope. The incline wasn't steep, just enough to be annoying, but as the oxygen level dropped, the annoyance turned to strain. After 20 minutes, even the most nimble students slowed. A Groxian with short limbs and a wide torso leaned against a rock and blinked slowly. Brenner walked past him, checking the student's pupil dilation. You seeing double? He asked, tapping the reader strap to the student's chest. The Groxian nodded, then shook his head, unsure. All right, sit. Hydrate slowly, small sips. Eyes closed. Another group further up the incline had started singing badly and in 3 conflicting keys. Brenner trudged over, crouched next to them, and took a reading. Your blood oxygens dropped below 70. You're euphoric. That's not good. Back down slowly. One wearing student blinked hard, translucent skin taking on a milky sheen. I feel excellent. You're hallucinating. That's not a compliment. They grumbled but turned back. By the 2-hour mark, only 4 students remained above the halfway point. Brenner kept moving between them, his own breathing slow and rhythmic. He'd trained for the simulation the week before by sleeping in a decompression tent and doing push-ups until his vision fuzzed. A Kintari student with an unusually thin frame stumbled near the top, knees buckling. Brenner reached them in 3 strides, catching their fall. "Talk to me," he said, pressing the emergency extraction beacon. "I forgot where I was going," the student whispered. "You're going back." "That's where?" An overhead beacon pulsed violet and a safety drone descended, securing the student in a harness. Brenner watched them lift off, then sat on a flat rock, lungs burning faintly. He hadn't realized how quiet the chamber had gotten. Only one student remained near the top, a squat, 4-legged creature with a carapace that shimmered faintly. They moved with deliberate steps, pausing every few seconds to check a wrist-mounted monitor. "Name," Brenner called. "Teln," they said without stopping. "You still clear-headed?" "Yes." "Counting backward in base 11. "Of course you are." They reached the designated summit marker and tapped it, then turned back down. Brenner met them halfway. "What's the trick?" he asked. "Low center of gravity, 4 limbs. And I trained in methane-rich caves as a juvenile. Never get altitude sickness in a cave." "Exactly." They walked back down together slowly. Brenner's legs felt like they were made of wet cement. Once outside the chamber, the students lay sprawled across mats, rehydrating and flushing their systems with oxygen-rich mist. Vexil stood by with a medical scanner, scanning each one with mechanical efficiency. "You were at 83% saturation," Vexil said, passing Brenner a pouch of glucose gel. "I've felt worse." "You've looked worse." "Thanks for that." Vexil turned to a Groxian student who was chewing on a data tablet. "That's not edible." The student looked confused. "It tastes like information." Brenner sat near the edge of the mat, watching the others recover. No one had needed resuscitation. No limbs had gone blue. For a simulation that mimicked one of the most dangerous natural phenomena in the galaxy, it had gone remarkably well. Pradix approached, holding a tablet. "You reduced incidence of hyposic disorientation by 72% compared to last year's class." "I'm not sure if that's a compliment or a warning about last year." "Both." He crouched beside Brenner, which for a Kintari meant folding his limbs like a collapsed ladder. "The students have requested additional instruction from you," Pradix said. "They want to learn improvisation techniques without simulations. Field work, unscripted, no modules, no safety nets." Brenner leaned back. "That sounds like a liability nightmare. That is why we are opening it to volunteers only, no credits, just experience. And you want me to lead it. Unless you would prefer to return to your previous studies." Brenner looked around. Students were helping each other recalibrate breathing monitors. One was writing notes with a stylus held between 2 claws. Another practiced walking in a straight line with their eyes closed. He exhaled through his nose. "All right." "But I pick the terrain." "Agreed." "And I get 2 days to sleep." 1.5, 2. Pradix hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. Later that evening, Brenner sat on the edge of the habitat dome, overlooking the sunward horizon. The sky was streaked with layered reds and bruised purples, the atmosphere still carrying echoes of the last storm. His ribs still ached. His left shoulder twinged when he turned too fast. But his breathing had evened out, and his fingers no longer trembled from oxygen deprivation. Vexil joined him with a small container of nutrient bars. "You're not normal," the Groxian said, taking a seat. "I've been told. You do things wrong, backward, you overexert, you ignore pain thresholds. And yet, you live." Brenner broke a bar in half. "You think that's impressive? I think it's confusing." He handed Vexil the other half. "I'll take it." They sat in silence, the stars beginning to show through the thinning clouds. Somewhere below, a group of students were laughing an off-key harmony of alien voices, still adjusting to the strange idea that survival could be taught by someone who looked like he'd barely survived himself. Brenner lay back, arms crossed behind his head. He wasn't teaching them to be human. He was teaching them something simpler, that when everything breaks, you still have choices. You adapt or you stop, you bleed or you brace, you fall or you find a way to crawl, and sometimes you just build a shelter out of whatever you've got left. No one said it had to be pretty. It just had to hold.